Welcome to the program, Nigel Inkster.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
CNN reported that several US military bases in Europe have been put on a higher state of alert amid the concerns of a possible terrorist attacks against the US military personnel. From your perspective, could it be also connected to the increase of Russia's hidden activities in Europe?
Well, it's very difficult to say. The US authorities have been very tight-lipped about the nature of the threat. It could be one of two things. One possibility is that it is a jihadist plot that has been detected. We've seen Islamic State in Khorasan, the branch of Islamic State that is based in Afghanistan, undertaking more overseas attacks. And there have been concerns about the security threat to the Paris Olympics as well. So it's possible that this is a straightforward jihadist attack which has been identified. It's not inconceivable, however, that this might be some form of Russian undertaking. We just don't know.
Several Russian spies have been arrested in Germany. Do you feel they try to do some sabotage against US military installations? Do you feel that we are in the middle of the spy war?
Well, I think that's pretty much the case, yes. We saw after the Russian invasion of Ukraine that many European countries expelled known Russian intelligence officers operating in legal residencies, in other words, in embassies and other official Russian facilities. And the Russians have had to regroup and are engaged in more sabotage operations in Europe. I think that's been clearly established, and are using a variety of proxies for these missions, in particular individuals from countries like Bulgaria and Serbia, where pro-Russian sympathies are more easily found. And I think there have been enough documented cases of Russian sabotage attempts to make it beyond doubt that this is something that Russia is engaged in, a kind of grey zone, hybrid warfare, call it what you like.
In your opinion, how successful are such Russia's sabotage attempts in Europe?
Well, they've had some effect. We've seen, for example, factories burnt down. There was a particular case in, I think, the Czech Republic, where a very significant munitions manufacturing factory was destroyed. There was a case in the UK. There have been other cases, efforts to sabotage European railroads transporting munitions and other capabilities to Ukraine. But I think overall, the effect has been limited. This is not something to, however, underplay or make light of. It is a problem, it is a threat, and it is going to require constant vigilance on the part of European security agencies to monitor and prevent this kind of activity.
Don't you think that such sabotage attempts are possible signs of Vladimir Putin's desperation?
I wouldn't put it quite like that, because I don't think Putin does feel desperate at the moment. I think he feels that he can sustain hostilities in Ukraine for as long as needed, and can outweight Ukraine's principal allies. So I don't think he feels desperate yet. I think it's more a case of doing everything that he possibly can do to degrade efforts to assist Ukraine. I think it's more that.
From your perspective, is it possible for Russia's intelligence to disrupt aid for Ukraine, to disrupt those logistics and aid roads to Ukraine?
They're certainly trying to, but it's not clear that they've had very much success in, delaying provision of needed equipment and goods to Ukraine. Arguably, much more harm was done by the delays in the U.S. Congress in approving the most recent appropriations bill in aid for Ukraine. That had probably a far more direct effect on Ukraine's ability to maintain its defenses than Russian sabotage efforts.
Do you expect the West to retaliate, to act in order to reply and to answer such sabotage operations on the European soil?
Not directly, and not by undertaking reciprocal activities. Russia would like to drag the West down to its level. And I think it would be a very grave mistake for the West to allow itself to be dragged down to Russia's level. The fact is that European nations are not in a state of war with Russia. Indeed, Russia, formally speaking, doesn't consider itself in a state of war because it doesn't describe its activities in Ukraine as war. It describes it as a special military operation. So there is no legal basis for European nations to respond in kind. And I think it would be a grave mistake for them, as I said, to allow themselves to be dragged down to Russia's level, where Russia is prepared to do literally anything without regard for norms of conduct or basic decency.
Also, it seems like Russia's spies and Russia's intelligence agencies are cautious. In Europe, they're trying to not to use their own agents, but to buy other people from other nations. Do you feel that it's a sign that they're trying to be cautious while doing some sabotage actions on European soil?
Well, they're obviously trying to engage in activities that are deniable. If they don't, involve Russian nationals, then it's difficult to attribute any activities to the Russian state. I think it's the reality is that they're using a lot of criminal groups to undertake these activities. And the criminals who undertake them are, to be blunt, not particularly bright and certainly not well trained, and hence much likely to be effective than properly trained professionals who are properly motivated to undertake the attacks that they do. A lot of this is being undertaken by people who are simply being paid to undertake particular tasks in which they themselves are not particularly invested. So I think there is a trade-off here. If you can't use your own professionals because it's difficult to get them into Europe, and you want in any case to operate deniably, then you pay the penalty in terms of having to use much lower grade operatives to undertake these operations.
You said that it's really difficult for the Russian side to get their own nationals to Europe. Do you think that it's a difficult task for Russia to get their national agents to the European soil to conduct any kind of sabotage activities?
Well, it's not impossible, but it is more difficult. If you're not using legal residencies, you're using what we term illegals, takes much more preparation and involves more risk. So it is more difficult. But I'm sure that I have no doubt that Russia will continue to do whatever it can by whatever means it decides are most appropriate and feasible. So I certainly don't think that we're going to see a reduction in Russian efforts to undertake these operations. But in some ways, yes, it is getting more difficult for them.
From your perspective, are they also afraid of possible retaliation to such sabotage actions. Don't you think that could be a reason why they are so cautious in Europe?
Well, it's possible that Russia is mirror imaging, in other words, assuming that Western countries would behave exactly as they do. It's a common phenomenon. But if that is the case, it doesn't seem, if they do believe that, then it's not having any obvious deterrent effect. And the simple fact that that none of these things have happened. Although when situations do arise in Russia, for example, terrorist attacks that have nothing to do with Ukraine, nothing to do with Europe, the Russian state is always quick to try and impute some degree of responsibility to Ukraine or to other Western forces, arguing that they're behind the attacks, even if they've been undertaken by entities like Islamic State.
You mentioned about the situation in Russia. Recently, there have been some terrorist attacks in Dagestan against churches. Do you feel that Russian authorities, Russia's intelligence agencies are too focused on Ukraine and now they're not doing enough to save the country, to defend their nation against terrorist threats?
That's quite possible, yes. I mean, there have been two major attacks in Russia this year undertaken by Islamic State Khorasan, the branch of Islamic State that is located or based in Afghanistan. There was, the Crocus Concert Hall in March, and now the recent attacks in Dagestan. And it does begin to look as if, it's more complicated than that, because I think that in the case of the Crocus Concert Hall, if my understanding is correct, the US did provide Russia with warnings about an impending terrorist attack, and these were brushed aside. That's quite a common thing. This often happens when Western intelligence services try and share something with their Russian counterparts. They tend to ignore it or to discount it. So clearly, they were, not only were they not looking for this, but they weren't even interested in trying to look for it. And I think that probably the same thing applied in Dagestan. I mean, we're talking particularly in North Caucasus about an area under effectively Russian colonial domination, where Islamist sentiments and resentment against the Russian Federation are widespread, and it's hence and obviously effective or desirable area for Islamic State to target. One where they would naturally find a lot of sympathizers.
How significant is this Islamic terror threat for the Russian regime right now?
I think it is. It's not trivial. I think it's unlikely to be an existential threat to the Russian regime. These terrorist movements rarely do present an existential threat to nation states. But Russia and to a degree China are both clearly targets for Islamic State Khorasan, as is indeed Europe more generally. So I think that we can confidently expect more incidents of this kind taking place, not just in Russia, but in the other countries that I've mentioned as well. Islamic State Khorasan has regrouped. It is showing itself more capable and more ambitious. But in addition to undertaking orchestrated and planned attacks, they're also encouraging what Western intelligence services have referred to as Nike terrorism. In other words, telling their supporters, just go and do something, undertake a terrorist attack. It doesn't need planning, just take a knife and start attacking people in the street, or jump into a van and drive it into a crowd of pedestrians, that kind of terrorism. So there is a general risk. Russia is, I think, no more or no less at risk than anywhere else that is seen by Islamic State Khorasan as an enemy.
How do you see the fragilities of Russia's regime right now?
That's a very difficult question to answer. I mean, on the face of it, it would seem that Vladimir Putin is very much in control. He appears to have eliminated most effective forms of political opposition. His security forces are in control. But I can never remember whether it was Lenin or Trotsky who said that when an autocrat is in power, his overthrow seems inconceivable, but once it's happened, it seems inevitable. So regimes of this type always have this underlying fragility. That said, I think that the problem with the Putin regime, and effectively what we're talking about here, is nothing less than a criminal conspiracy masquerading as a nation state, that the political processes have been so debased and so degraded. I think it would be very difficult in present circumstances for anything better to replace what is there now. Even if Vladimir Putin was to drop dead tomorrow, I fear that the prospect of some kind of better, more benign Russian regime emerging at the moment is very limited.
From your perspective, are there any kind of other voices in the Russian regime that are opposed to the continuation of war against Ukraine, and how can they play their own role in that?
Well, I mean, I think it's clear that there are, but at the same time, it's also fairly clear that a lot of ordinary people, and indeed elites within Russia, have got behind Vladimir Putin. So, I mean, I think the immediate impact of dissenting voices in Russia are going to be relatively uninfluential in the short term. I think essentially it obviously one hopes at the moment people who are opposed to what Vladimir Putin is doing probably have no alternative at the moment but to keep their heads down and hope for better times to come. But I think more important in the short term is for countries supporting Ukraine's fight to defend its sovereignty remain strong and supportive of this undertaking.
I would like also to cover the recent visit of Vladimir Putin to the North Korea. Do you expect the increase of intelligence sharing between both countries?
Possibly, yes. So I'm not sure realistically what intelligence North Korea would have that would be of particular utility to Vladimir Putin. I think that we don't know the full substance of what was discussed and agreed during Vladimir Putin's recent visit to Pyongyang, during which the relationship was formally upgraded. And we're now seeing Kim Jong-un talking about the relationship as one with of partnership and alliance like measures. So there's been an upgrade, but essentially, what does Vladimir Putin want from this relationship? He wants two things. Firstly, continued North Korean supplies of basic munitions, particularly artillery shells, and secondly, at a geopolitical level, to create uncertainty and instability by signaling the fact of this improved relationship with North Korea. And of course, North Korea, as a pariah state, is keen to demonstrate that it has friends still. And the two leaders do share a desire to undermine and eventually replace the Western-led global order with something that is more favorable to their interests and values. But I think one aspect in all of this which needs to be looked at is how China would have viewed this development. And I'm not sure that China's leaders will be that happy to see such activity taking place, because it's long been the position of the Chinese Communist Party that the status quo on the Korean Peninsula is effectively the least bad option available to China, and they wouldn't necessarily be happy to see something that destabilized or produced a worse situation, a worse outcome than that which already exists. So, I think that China actually has quite a strong vested interest in ensuring that this relationship between Russia and North Korea does not get out of control.
But why hasn't the West reacted to such escalation in cooperation between Russia and North Korea? Why hasn't we seen any kind of new sanctions, new restrictions, or diplomatic response, or even military one?
Well, I don't think anybody wants to engage in military activities against North Korea. For better or worse, North Korea is now a nuclear-armed state, and has, I think, a very clear focus on regime survival. And I'm pretty sure most people believe that Kim Jong-un would do whatever it takes, including the use of nuclear weapons, in order to prevent his regime from collapsing or being overthrown. So I don't think a military option makes any kind of sense in current circumstances. As to sanctions, well, if you can identify any area where North Korea isn't already subject to pretty severe sanctions, I think I'd be interested to hear it, because there is not much more in the way of direct sanctions that realistically can be applied to North Korea at the moment. So I think the important thing in all of this is not to overreact. To engage in what doctors call watchful waiting, waiting to see how this relationship evolves, and thinking what action might be necessary if it evolves in undesirable directions. But I think it would be a very bad idea to be too precipitate in responding to a relationship that's still awaiting definition.
But don't you think that a lack of response to such a deal between defense pact between North Korea and Russia could just allow both countries to continue to increase the level of relations and the level of military cooperation?
Well, that clearly will happen, but how much of an impact is going to have on matters of immediate concern, in particular in relation to Ukraine, difficult to say. As I said, and bear in mind that China has a voice in all of this. Really, China is the power that matters in this three-cornered relationship with Russia and North Korea. And I'm pretty confident that China, as I said before, has no interest whatsoever in seeing this relationship get out of control.
Thank you, Mr. Inkster, for your time and for your support for Ukraine. Glory to Ukraine.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to talk to you.